Ladies and gentlemen, can we start this panel? My name is Donatas Kupčiūnas. I'm a Baltic Fellow at the Center for Geopolitics, and it's great to see here so many familiar and soon-to-be familiar faces. We've got an excellent lineup today. We even have someone joining or originating actually from Belarus itself. So there will be Belarusian trace here as well. So the Minsk agreements, or Minsk disagreements. Before I introduce our excellent panel, perhaps a few words about what those Minsk agreements were and why they are important for those of you who have not read them. I've got them here. It's a few pages, but very interesting pages of sort of quasi-legal diplomatic language, and a few pages of painful compromises, I would say, that no one really liked. These were a series of agreements designed to stop the escalation of the war in Donbass in 2014 and 2015. And negotiations of these agreements were mediated by Angela Merkel and François Hollande. We're talking here essentially about three documents. They're essentially ceasefire agreements, first of all, that talk about stopping of hostilities, demilitarization of the line of contact between the opposing forces, the monitoring mission of the OSCE, and so on. But they also have clauses on the constitutional change in Ukraine. And the formula in those agreements was quite simple. To put it in one sentence, Putin gets a special status for Lugansk and Donetsk regions and gets to influence Ukrainian politics through that opening in return for leaving Ukraine in peace, or so they said. And Ukraine agreed to all of that, including constitutional change, to give autonomy to those two regions, because they were in a very bad situation, militarily speaking. If you remember, in 2015, at the time of signing the last batch of these agreements, the Russians have surrounded a few thousand Ukrainian troops in Debaltseve and so on. Now, of course, today we know that all these agreements failed. Both sides accuse each other on sabotaging them. And for instance, on the Russian Foreign Ministry website, you can even have an analysis point by point, clause by clause on what the Ukrainians failed to implement. And actually, breaking of the Minsk agreements has been quoted by Putin as one of the major pretexts for starting the war in 2022. Now, why these agreements are controversial in academic discussion, and why are we having this panel today? It's very simple. So some historians and analysts, especially from realist school of thought, claim that this was a missed opportunity on the part of Ukraine, first of all, because Ukraine is never going to get a better deal from Russia than the one agreed in Minsk. And that Ukraine could have dodged this latest war entirely had it observed the Minsk agreements. And there is another school of thought that focuses on the humiliating nature of the Minsk agreements for Ukraine, and who claim that these agreements were essentially capitulation of Ukraine under Western pressure. So I hope to have a bit of disagreement on those points today. So let me introduce to you the first speaker today, Dr. Jakob Hauter. He received his PhD from University of College London, School of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies in 2022. And previously he studied international relations in Dresden, St. Petersburg, Bath, and Siena. He also worked as a Russian and Ukrainian media and current affairs analyst for the United States mission to the United Kingdom. He's also the author of the monograph that's most important for us today here, which is called Russia's Overlooked Invasion, the Causes of the 2014 outbreak of war in Ukraine's Donbass. So, Jakob, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It is a great honor to be part of this panel today. In particular, I would like to thank Andreas Umland, who sadly isn't able to be here today and who suggested me to replace him. So please forgive me for starting my remarks with some shameless self-promotion. This is my book, Russia's Overlooked Invasion, which was published by Ibidem in September last year. And it is a streamlined version of my PhD thesis. And it traces the escalation of violence in the Donbass from right after the Maidan up to the first Minsk agreement in early September 2014. So it provides important context for a better understanding of the first Minsk agreement and also the second Minsk agreement, which followed 5 months later, and which is actually quite similar in terms of content. If you would like to get a signed copy of my book, feel free to approach me later. I brought some copies with me. But I would also like to highlight this project, which I worked on together with the great team at Forensic Architecture back in 2018, 2019. And here we gathered the available open source evidence for Russia's involvement in the Battle of Ilovaisk in eastern Ukraine. And this battle happened just days before the first Minsk agreement was signed. And we gathered the evidence and then published this evidence in a structured way on an interactive online platform. So this provides additional in-depth insights into what the situation in Ukraine was like just before the first Minsk agreement was signed. So let's have a little recap of what happened in the run-up to the Minsk agreements. In March 2014, Russia annexed Crimea. In April, Russia let Igor Girkin and his group of armed men who had helped with the annexation of Crimea travel on to the Donbass and essentially start the armed conflict there by occupying Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. In May and June, Russia deployed additional irregular forces to the Donbass to further escalate the conflict, and among them was the now notorious Wagner Group. In June and July, Russia supplied these irregular forces in the Donbass with tanks and heavy artillery, and also with the Buk air defense system that shot down Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 on 17th of July. However, all this in the end turned out to be not enough to defeat the Ukrainian armed forces. So in late August 2014, the situation of Russia's irregular forces in the Donbass became rather precarious. So Russia sent in regular units to push back the Ukrainian military. So this is the situation we are in at the time of the first Minsk agreement. Russia had continuously escalated its covert invasion of Ukraine and in the end inflicted a major defeat on the Ukrainian military using its regular armed forces. Now you might ask, hang on, isn't that only part of the story? Where are the demonstrations by pro-Russian activists in the Donbass? Where are the local residents who fought against the Ukrainian military for the separatist cause? And sure, these factors definitely did play a part. But in my book, I argue that they were outshadowed by Russia's actions. And that if you take away Russian direct involvement, the Donbass probably would have seen some civil unrest, potentially even a certain degree of militarized violence, but this would have never turned into a full-fledged war in the way it actually did over the summer of 2014. And here lies the key problem with the Minsk agreement. They would have been a potentially viable solution to solve a small-scale domestic conflict. But they fail to address the fact that what happened in the Donbass was actually a covert invasion of one country by another. Both Minsk agreement included 5 key provisions: there was a ceasefire, local elections, an amnesty, the withdrawal of all foreign troops and equipment, and constitutional reform. But what they failed to do is prioritize the withdrawal of foreign troops over domestic issues. It's difficult to imagine local elections under what is essentially an occupation regime. They also failed to name Russia as the party responsible for withdrawing troops and equipment. They didn't recognize Russia as a conflict party. And most importantly, they completely ignored the key underlying issue: Ukraine's integration with the West. And this is the elephant in the room. Russia had just invaded Ukraine. And this was not about local issues, or not about language, regional autonomy. Special status for the Donbass didn't really matter that much for Russia, other than as a tool to exert influence over Ukraine as a whole, and exert influence on foreign policy and defense policy in Kiev. And if we look at the death and destruction that Russia has caused since 2022 in places like Mariupol, Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and many other places, that should have really wiped out any last illusions that Russia actually cared about the Donbass and the people living in that region of Ukraine. So this whole thing was about geopolitics. It was really about Russia's unwillingness to give up its imperialist ambitions in Ukraine and let Ukraine continue its course towards independence and European integration. So it is quite clear that the Minsk agreements had little potential to provide a lasting solution. But what about Angela Merkel's famous remarks from 2022 that the Minsk agreements bought Ukraine time? Well, there might actually be some truth in this. It seems relatively clear that the Ukrainian military was in a better position to fight the Russian army in February 2022 than it was in September 2014. But at the same time, I would say that much more could have been done in the meantime, both in terms of supporting and preparing the Ukrainian armed forces, but also in terms of putting pressure on Russia and trying to dissuade it from launching a full-scale invasion. Military support for Ukraine remained limited. I mean, remember, Javelin anti-tank missiles were a huge deal when they were first delivered. And sanctions against Russia remained weak. Business as usual largely continued. And the most infamous example of this is the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project. Russia had just invaded Ukraine, and it was essentially rewarded by this, for this by Germany with the construction of a gas pipeline that had the sole purpose of circumventing Ukraine. Of course, there's not much point now in lamenting the mistakes of the past and missed opportunities. The key question has to be, what lessons can we learn from this failure of the Minsk agreements? And I would say the answer is relatively clear. We simply must not repeat the same mistake. There must not be some sort of Minsk III that sort of freezes the war while leaving Ukraine in a vulnerable position. Russia won't be content just with the Donbass, and it must not get a third chance to destroy Ukraine after it tried in 2014 and then with additional vigor in 2022. There's a lot of discussion today about whether this war can be won on the battlefield or whether additional diplomatic efforts and a return to the negotiating table are required. But I would suggest that this debate actually diverts attention from the most important lesson that we have to learn from 2014 and 2022. So no matter how much occupied territory Ukraine will be able to retake by force, and no matter when and how peace negotiations resume, was pointed out previously very correctly that essentially all wars at some point end with some sort of negotiations. But the key thing really is that Ukraine needs to have the ability to deter Russia in the future. And some toothless assurances and declarations of intent simply won't do the trick here. So no matter what the demarcation line for another possible ceasefire will be, Ukraine either has to be provided with an amount of weapons that will stop Russia from even thinking about another escalation attempt, or it needs some kind of credible security guarantees similar to what we have with NATO Article 5. And I'll leave it here. Thank you very much for your attention. Look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Jakob. And our next speaker is Professor Richard Sakwa, who is Professor Emeritus of Russian and European Politics at the University of Kent at Canterbury, and a Senior Research Fellow at the National Research University Higher School of Economics in Moscow. He has published widely on Russian, post-communist and international affairs, and his book, Deception, Russiagate and the New Cold War, was published by Lexington Books in early 2022. And his latest book, The Lost Peace, How the West Failed to Prevent a Second Cold War, was published with Yale University Press in 2023. So, Professor Sakwa, looking forward to what you have to say.
Thanks very much. I'm going to take a slightly different line, and I'm going to begin with Jean-Luc Godard's great French film director's dictum that every film should have a beginning, a middle, and an end, but not necessarily in that order. So I'm going to begin with a conclusion, having heard earlier presentations, so to set the context. So what would my conclusion, what would I have been arguing? And quite clearly, having heard the discussion so far, that we are faced with what Baroness Ashton talked about, a looking glass metaphor, the fact that there seems to be an epistemological gulf in meaning between the way that Western-oriented people look at the things and the way that others, including now a larger portion of the global south, looks at international affairs today. So there's a huge gulf between it. It's like I use the analogy of a Rubens vase. Either you can see a vase or you can see two faces, but you cannot see both simultaneously. And that seems to be the way that academia has gone now. But I actually believe that the task of the academic, I humbly put myself forward as one, is to try to make sense of this. I mean, we could identify the issue, a complete gulf in understanding, even ontology, simply how you understand the world. So my conclusion would have made 2 points. The first one would have contextualized it. In other words, that we are looking at a longer time span, and that Minsk, in that context, can be seen as a metaphor. It's a way of dealing with it, maybe imperfect, but it offered a pathway to the solution of a complex, a knotty problem. And of course, it's in that sequence that we can put the Istanbul agreements of March-April 2022, which you could have argued was a Minsk III agreement. So what is the context? Quite obviously, the context, as described in my book, The Lost Peace, is that after the end of Cold War I, there were two major visions of how the European and global peace order should look. Both rather good, both drawing on similar sort of framework, but at every single major document at the end of the Cold War, even before the Helsinki Final Act, you have these two fundamental principles. That is the need for indivisible security all the way from Lisbon to Vladivostok. At the same time, the freedom of choice. And these, I mean, I could articulate that at much greater depth, but we have two clear visions of how we should proceed. And of course, Moscow and its others, and indeed Beijing, go along with the argument that this second vision of indivisibility of security was important, and that you would have no European security order unless all European states were satisfied with the order. And quite obviously, it was not. So in other words, we were getting an Ukrainian issue is part of a far larger context, and it's how, in fact, many books would talk about it, how we squandered that opportunity at the end of the First Cold War, 1989-91, to build a genuinely inclusive security order, all the way from Helsinki, the Paris Agreement in November 1990, the Istanbul agreements and the Astana agreements. All of them have this tension within them, a contradiction. So that's the first context. The second one, more specifically on Ukraine. And we've just heard the argument that the events in 2014 represented a Russian invasion. Now, and this debate continues and very embittered. And in fact, people, was it a civil war? Or was it a Russian invasion? Or what combination of the two? And as I say, either some people see one side of it, if you're in Moscow or elsewhere, or just the other side. I think it's more complex than that. There's a whole stack of literature which now examines this question. We've just heard one of them. But it also ties in with a larger question, which is the model of Ukrainian state building all the way from beginning 1991. And of course, the literature defines in various ways this division between the types of state building and nation building that was facing Ukraine, which of course Minsk took that tested that very much. There's various ways to describe it. On the one side, you could say the Galician, the Western Ukrainian vision, which is this European idea. And on the other side, you have various, you could call it East Slavic, you could call it Orthodox, you could call it the Novorossiya model, and so on. Nikolai Petro discusses all of that. There's also an even deeper division, and this is described by Olga Baysha, B-A-Y-S-H-A, in a marvelous book, who describes the tension between a uni-progressive Enlightenment vision, which is the one we've heard about a lot, which is the European destiny for Ukraine, this European choice, and Europe, of course, now presented as a sort of indissoluble, a homogeneous, as the replacement for the Soviet temporal vision of building socialism, and you give up that, and now you go to Europe as the solution to all the problems of development, political inclusion, and societal integration. So, and Olga Baysha's book on miscommunicating social change describes that marvelously. And of course, if you have that vision, you have a vision of the nation, of a progressive, Maidan enthusiastic way, leading all the way with the flags to the West. And by definition, you delegitimate and discredit the anti-Maidan, which is very powerful all the way through. All the way through, anti-Maidan was not that it was opposed to challenging the corruption of the Yanukovych regime, but it was saying, look, we need a different model of state building and nation building, a more inclusive, more pluralistic vision. Europe is part of the answer, but of course we all know the opinion polls at that time were far more ambivalent than later put forward. And of course, if you delegitimate them, what do you talk about the Donbass people? You call them Vatniki, you call them Sovoks, you call them backward, unthinking, passive. Just as I've heard so many times this morning, the Russians are characterized as unthinking, passive mass, and so on, which I think is misleading. Also, of course, this division, Vladimir Ishchenko talks about this, the very profound Soviet identity, not a Soviet identity in his view, which is backward-looking. It's in fact quite the opposite. It's a different vision of modernity within Ukraine. So there were multiple visions of modernity, and this uni idea, which of course dominates in the political West today, is also then imposed and exacerbated the divisions within Ukraine. So that civil war is about Donbass, but it's about a bigger issue, divisions within Ukrainian society. So that's the second, and I could go on a bit more about that, but I won't in terms of a conclusion. But as for Minsk itself, we heard some of the details about it, but as I say, that we talked about Istanbul as a possibility as a Minsk III agreement. The deal, which we'd heard about this morning, of the 21st of February 2014 could be called Minsk -1, if you like, the pre-Minsk, because that deal did offer a real chance. I mean, it's hardly mentioned now, but that deal, which was negotiated by the three European Union foreign ministers and the ambassador, it really did offer a way, pre-term elections by the end of 2014, a way forwards, but it was rejected by the Maidan itself, Pasachuk and all the others in very emotional speeches that evening. And the fact is that the European Union just walked away, as if it didn't happen, forgot about it. And of course, that is why Minsk becomes a syndrome. It's why the title of my talk. It is a syndrome of the repeated failure of Western powers to follow through on agreements which they themselves have negotiated. I mean, we're talking about, indeed, within Ukraine as well. Minsk 2, of course, we talked about Minsk 1, which was September 2014. Minsk 2, which is built on the first one of February 2015, after we heard about Ilovaisk, but after Debaltseve. The key point about these Minsk agreements was that it provided a framework for the resolution of the Donbass, and more than that, of a different vision of a foundation for a more, what I would call a more pluralistic, multicultural, multilingual, more generous political settlement within Ukraine, as opposed to the monist, this line of sort of absolutely only single choice, European choice, and so on, which is, as I say, uniprogressive and therefore exclusive. The deals, and it was a framework for the reincorporation of the Donbass republics into the Ukrainian state. So that's the fundamental point. So those who argue that Putin was intent on re-establishing the Soviet Empire, Russian Empire, Muscovy even, which of course is more and more those mystical elements in his rhetoric nowadays, that they miss out. So why did Russia go along and support Minsk for so many years when it was actually a way of re-establishing these two republics within Ukraine? Yes, it would have meant a change of that Ukrainian statehood, but that may have been no bad thing. That's the point. This Minsk syndrome closed down not just a debate and exacerbated the Cold War, what I call the Second Cold War, which is outside, but it also then simply exacerbated those divisions within, and it offered a pathway to reincorporation. And of course, we know that within Ukraine there was this anti-capitulationist movement. Now, who was it? Who managed to, you could argue, hijack the Ukrainian polity? I mean, Maidan has, in my view, and I never understood how it could be represented, as some sort of constituent assembly to which the government, which was elected through a democratic election, should be responsible to Maidan. I mean, I often say that would be marvelous. Maybe we could have one in Trafalgar Square and hold the government responsible to whoever cause you may wish to put forwards. It's just nonsense. That you have procedures, Minsk -1 was a way forwards, Minsk 1 was, Minsk 2, and Minsk 3. So it was always forwards. It was about the return of the republics to Ukrainian sovereignty, but Ukrainian sovereignty would change. Yes, it was a program for state change within Ukraine. But as I say, maybe no bad thing, because who are these anti-capitulationists? August 2015, when Poroshenko tried to make some modest amendments to the Ukrainian constitution in light of Minsk, what happens? You have violent insurrection at the gates outside the Rada with a hand grenade tossed in and a few people killed. In other words, the Ukrainian polity was being driven by a very narrow, ultra-nationalist, non-capitulationist line, which again was completely anti-democratic. So the more we talk about European choice and democratic Ukraine, at the same time, that is not a Europe I recognize. For me, Europe is a peace project, it's a democratic project, not one which is an abstract ideology of Europeanism, undermines the values on which Europe should be built. And unfortunately, we see this divergence ever more sharply. This geopolitical Europe is undermining the normative foundations on which it was established. Just to say that inside Ukraine, Minsk was supported in various ways. Even the virulent, very strongly pro-Western Viktor Pinchuk in December 2016 argued that Ukraine must make painful compromises for peace with Russia. It isn't just about with Russia, in my view, it's with itself and with its other constituencies and its own people, because the people in Donbass, as far as Minsk is concerned, are Ukrainian citizens. As I say, it was just a different vision of how Ukraine should be organized. Igor Kolomoisky, I know a controversial figure, made the same argument, of course, got the anti-capitulationists highly disagreed with that. So, but at all occasions, the deal was stalled on. So I'll just say, in light of all of these acknowledged, when of course we've just heard about Angela Merkel, Putin later admitted his naivety about the West. This is the December 23 interview with Pavel Slunkin, for example. He said he was wrong to assume that the West would establish productive relations with Russia after the collapse of Soviet Union. As I say, a totally different narrative from the one we hear usually in the West. I'm not judging one or the other. I'm simply saying our job is to make sense that both are logical, both are coherent, and both have a right to exist, just as the anti-Maidan had a right to exist within Ukraine. I spent a lot of time in Odessa with the other anti-Maidan. So it has a right to exist, and I think a better Ukraine would have emerged at the end of it. So what ultimately could we identify, how could we identify a Minsk syndrome? And I'd suggest 5 different elements. The first is the internal blockage on intra-Ukrainian solution to the elements of civil war, call it what you like, unleashed by the Maidan revolution. There'd long-term been regional cleavages in voting patterns. The April 29 election, when Zelensky was elected, promised reconciliation, but very quickly Zelensky was forced by the so-called anti-capitulationists. Who are they? To renege on that. And of course they met in the Normandy format in December 2019, which of course didn't go well. The second element is the external blockage on some sort of accommodation with Moscow. This second Cold War is far deeper, far more pervasive, and far more dangerous than the first ever was. In the first Cold War, there were always back-channel discussions, always diplomacy. Today, nothing. This is a complete sterile ground because of this vision of a completely illegitimate power over to the east, which is quite clearly, Washington had long been wary of accepting the validity of Moscow's security concerns. I'm a realist in that sense. For me, its intervention was all about security rather than empire. And it further delegitimated its standing as a serious negotiating partner. Negotiation was considered appeasement, that even opening a negotiation is considered a privilege, which is, of course, negotiations diplomacy is all about dealing with difference. But, of course, this political West, which has emerged, cannot deal with difference. It can, we have democracies versus autocracies, and you don't talk to those guys. From this perspective, it's always 1938. Always 1938. And of course, we know how that ended. The third element is the bad faith and political inefficacy of the political West in general. Although in standing in defense of fundamental norms and principles, these very principles prevent their implementation. So we have a political West which is putting forward, undermining itself, the principles of sovereign internationalism, UN Charter ideas, and claiming as a rules-based order to stand as a sort of an interpreter of these rules. This brings us to the fourth aspect of the syndrome, the growing contempt for multilateralism represented by the UN and the Charter. This is on all sides. It's quite clear that today this UN system, the Charter international system established in 1945, is challenged as never before. That by all sides, that there's absolutely this danger. Without that Charter, and it's above all, a long time ago, the spirit of 1945. So 1945, the Charter system is more than just a set of institutions, of norms, of regulations, international law. It's that fundamental spirit of 1945 at the end of the Second World War, the most destructive war humanity's ever had. And yet the very spirit which informs that Charter international system has been undermined, eroded, and delegitimated. And so it's hugely dangerous. As I say, that's why this is far more dangerous than it was in the first Cold War. And everybody's now saying, well, clearly Russia should be kicked out of the Security Council. This is a Ukrainian argument, phenomenally dangerous and irresponsible in my view. The final aspect, which we can see from the failure of the Minsk idea, the Minsk metaphor, the Minsk process, is the distrust on all sides engendered by its failure. in Moscow, but also in the political West. Political West has admitted its bad faith in failing to follow through on the deal as it did for the 21st of February 2014 one. And of course, then we had argument buying time, a bulwark against Russia. Again, when you talk in diplomacy, you have empathy for the other side. Doesn't mean sympathy, of course not, but it means understanding the logic of action. And it's quite clear that this Rubin's vase operates principle, that there simply cannot be negotiation if you cannot even see the other side as an actor with concerns and such like. As I said, this applies not just to Moscow, but even to the other constituency within Ukraine itself. And the writing this out of history, I think, is hugely dangerous. We're in a deep impasse, and that ultimately is where the Minsk failures have led us to. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sakwa. And let's go straight to our third speaker, Mr. Pavel Slunkin, who was actually responsible for the smooth operation of Minsk talks in 2014-2015. He's now a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and prior to joining his current institution, he also worked for the Foreign Ministry of Belarus. Pavel, as I said, participated in Minsk talks and also worked as a political analyst at the Embassy of Belarus in Lithuania. And in 2020, he resigned in protest over the rigged elections and violence against the Belarusian people. He holds a bachelor's degree in international relations from Belarusian State University and is an alumnus of several programs at Klingendal Institute of International Relations in the Netherlands. So, Pavel, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Donald. Thank you to the University of Cambridge for inviting me. That's a great pleasure. The title of our panel asks the question if the Minsk agreements were another Munich or a missed opportunity, and I think that I should underline here that those two are not mutually exclusive. And I will try to explain this in my speech. But first, I want to start with an important disclaimer. I want to be crystal honest with you that I have my own personal and professional bias, and I want to disclose it to you. Minsk agreements are not just a regular international treaty to me. They have been part of first my professional life and later of my personal fate. In 2014, when we had Minsk I, and in 2015, when we had Minsk II, I was a young, idealistic, and a bit clumsy Belarusian diplomat who believed that promoting European path for my country from inside the government could make some important change. While when votes in your country are not counted, when protests are brutally cracked down, this was an alternative way to make Belarus civilized from inside. So this is my personal background when the Minsk process started. I was part of the Belarusian team who organized the negotiations. First so-called Minsk I, when Baroness Ashton came to Belarus with President Nazarbayev, President Poroshenko, and Mr. Putin, when they came to find solutions to stop the war. And I am thrilled to meet Baroness Ashton here, 10 years since that day. I also worked with the President Poroshenko when we had this Normandy Format meeting and negotiations in Minsk, when Ukrainian team arrived in February 2015 to Belarus. In 2020, as you, Donat, has mentioned, I resigned in protest, and this decision 2 months later made me leave my country a bit earlier than I would be arrested. And I moved to Ukraine, where I stayed before Russia invaded. So as you can see, there are a lot of reasons why I can't be totally objective on this issue. It already played so much role in my life. I saw how Minsk negotiations were born, and I was in Ukraine when they were killed by Russia. So here is my another confession. I don't stand with Ukraine. No, of course, I support it with all my deeds and words, but not because it's Ukraine. I stand with international norms and laws ruined by Russian aggression. I stand with the UN Charter and multiple resolutions that guarantee a sovereign state to states the right to choose their political path and territorial integrity. I stand with freedom, with the rule of law and democracy, and that is why I stand with Ukraine, not just because it is Ukraine. And now we come for the question, if this was a lost opportunity or another Munich. I think that it was both for all of the sides. In 2015, Ukraine desperately needed comprehensive and solid military support from its allies. Its army was not in a good shape after Yanukovych's rule, and the Minister of Defense, Mikhailo Yezhel, who was later appointed ambassador to Belarus and then received the refuge from Mr. Lukashenko, and he's still there, I think. The new government, after the Maidan Revolution, opened more than 50 cases against Mikhailo Yezhel for corruption and destruction of military logistics support of Ukraine. And I don't think that this was a coincidence. I think that this was on purpose. Russia, while we were talking in Minsk, Russia was moving forward and storming Debaltseve. And despite this horrifying background, Ukraine didn't receive the support it desperately needed from its allies. So I would say that Kyiv had no choice but to agree on the ceasefire. It was not the best solution, but yet a very needed one. Definitely much better than the collapse of its defense positions. Western partners were not ready to accept the new uncomfortable reality, the war in Europe, Russia turning into an enemy from a problematic partner, and the financial costs of the acceptance of this new reality that it would entail. The Western allies were self-trapped by the temptation to stay in their comfort zone, not calling a war, but calling it a crisis instead. You remember, many politicians in the West were calling this Ukraine crisis, not the war, even though the war started. I will share you one story from the negotiations that night. When after 17 hours, the leaders brokered the deal, when they agreed with the text, and everyone was happy that they finally reached something, Mr. Putin said that he can't approve the text because Russia is not part of the conflict. And he sent the text of the document to another building where the separatists were having their own negotiations. And only 30 minutes later, when separatists who were 100% controlled by Russia formally approved the text, he said, okay, and we accepted this. We accepted Russia that started the war, calling itself not an aggressor, but a side, staying somewhere aside, which is not true. So I do agree with Ms. Merkel when she says that Minsk agreements gave Ukraine a break to be prepared for the future attack. But this was an opportunity that the Western allies failed to address and failed to use. Minsk agreements trapped Ukraine in the middle of the road to Putin's further escalation. And that is why, in this sense, in some sense, it was another Munich, at least for Ukraine. Russia and its regime essentially were the same. I mean, the logics of the ruling allies, the logics of Putin, his imperialistic way of thinking, its neighbors, as Vigados called, as the slaves. It was 10 years ago, same as it is today. Russia has a better image, and it successfully hid it behind Gazprom and Rosneft reps. In 2015, it was yet important for Putin to keep this rep. Now it's not. This is why, when Ukraine was much weaker than it was in 2015, he didn't dare to openly invade with the whole Russia's army potential. In a sense, this was Putin's miscalculation when he later admitted this, saying that this was a loss of time and advantage. The problem is that, so for him, it was also a missed opportunity. He probably could gain much more with coming and invading openly 10 years ago. So he missed this opportunity. But we missed it too, with the Minsk agreement, signing it and forgetting Ukraine, not delivering the need that we needed to deliver to our ally. My stance towards Minsk agreements is that they were the best that the West could realistically, again, I underline this, realistically deliver to the challenge of war. Just because of this mind traps, calling it crisis, being afraid of Russia, being afraid of escalation. Minsk agreements was a weak decision, not enough, and in many sense, a very wrong response. But yet it was better than just letting the war continue and let Russia move forward against the unprepared Ukraine. So I probably should finish here, but I think that I would finish with this. Air defense systems help against drones and missiles much better than tweets of deep concerns after the airstrikes, and that's important to remember. Ammunition, tanks, jets, etc. help to stop the aggressor much better than when prior invasion you publicly confirm that you won't protect your ally militarily, as President Biden did. When Russian troops collected, were stationed near the border, and American leadership was asked if they're going to protect the ally, they said, no, sanctions will follow, but it will not protect. And I said to American journalists when they asked me about this, that this was an invitation. And again, we are at the same moment right now with this initiative of President Macron sending the troops to Ukraine to help Ukraine protect itself. I think this is our chance how we can broker a better deal for Ukraine. And I agree with what was said in the previous panels that all wars, they finish with negotiations. But what happened in Minsk 10 years ago, 9 years ago, and what some partners suggest Ukraine to have now, these are not negotiations. Negotiations is when you have a right to say, and not when you are dominated militarily. And Ukraine is now is somewhere on the edge of losing its freedom, its statehood. So in these terms, this negotiation just don't make sense. And this is our obligation to make this negotiation happen when Ukraine would be in a much better position. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Pavel. And finally, our fourth speaker is Dr. Erich Vad. Dr. Vad is a very senior figure in the military and political circles in Germany. He's the former general of the Bundeswehr, and he served as the German Chancellor Angela Merkel's military policy advisor from 2006 until 2013. In this role, he was also the Director of Security Policy in the Federal Chancellery and the Secretary of the Federal Security Council, which is essentially Germany's highest-ranking security body. Additionally, Erich Vad served as a senior advisor for the Conservative Party in the German Parliament in Berlin from 2000 to 2005. His previous assignments include positions in the German Defense Ministry, German Foreign Ministry, and the German Bundestag, and also NATO in Brussels. Dr. Vad, looking forward to your presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much. When Angela Merkel flew to Moscow at the beginning of her chancellorship on January 16, 2006, German-Russian relations were in a very good standing. 16 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was still a feeling of gratitude towards Russia, without whose consent there would have been no reunification of Germany. Political and economic relations were good. Helmut Kohl and Mikhail Gorbachev, as well as Boris Yeltsin, were on friendly terms, as were Gerhard Schröder and Vladimir Putin, until today. That's the problem. But Putin was different from his predecessors. For him, the collapse of the Soviet Union was a geopolitical catastrophe. He was concerned about the security of Russia's strategic periphery, especially in the Caucasus and Georgia, in Nagorno-Karabakh and Moldova, as well as in Belarus and not least in Ukraine, where he tried to push back all Western influence. in 2 wars against Chechnya, fought brutally on both sides in 1994 and 2009, the main Chechen city of Grozny was razed to the ground by Russian troops. At the time, Russia was already signaling that it did not accept separatist movements. Inner politically, Putin revised the rule that the governors of the regional authorities of the Russian Federation could be freely elected, and he justified this to Merkel by saying that he wanted to prevent the state from falling apart in the old Tsarist and Soviet tradition. He also nationalized the Russian oil and gas industry and suppressed any kind of political opposition. NATO's eastward expansion was always a thorn in Putin's side. He tried early on to prevent the Central Asian states and the surrounding ring of countries, Belarus, Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, from joining NATO. Basically, Angela Merkel had sympathy for Russia. She spoke fluent Russian and had traveled to the former Soviet Union several times. But Russia's rearmament, its unfriendly attitude towards the Baltic states, its decreasing tolerance towards dissenters, and the political killings of members of the opposition in Russia made Angela Merkel increasingly pensive. Nevertheless, bilateral German-Russian relations remained at a relatively normal level despite the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Until the invasion of Ukraine on February 22, which violated international law, regular government consultations took place with Russia. However, the ban on the activities of German non-governmental organizations in Russia in 2021 suspended the Petersburg dialogue with its meetings between politics, business, and society. Nevertheless, the channels of communication with the Kremlin remained intact until the end of Angela Merkel's terms in office in 2021. Alongside the financial and euro crisis, the 2015 wave of refugees and the coronavirus pandemic, the Ukraine conflict was a key issue for Angela Merkel during her time in office. In addition to intensive travel diplomacy, the highlight were the negotiations in Minsk on February 11th to 12th, 2015, which lasted all night. Angela Merkel was a master at this. She really needed very little sleep, a non-unimportant quality for today's top politicians. At that time, like today, the military situation was hopeless and bad for the Ukrainians. Putin could, if he had wanted to, have quickly advanced as far as Kiev. But he was satisfied with what had been achieved at the time and agreed to negotiations. Normally, you have a window of several weeks or months for such diplomatic negotiations. Here in Minsk, there were only a few hours available. They talked about the timing of a ceasefire, troop deployments, and the withdrawal of missile positions, modalities for the OSCE observer mission, the preparation and holding of elections, agreements for amnesty, and the autonomy of Luhansk and Donetsk. Foreign Minister Steinmeier was also represented at the Minsk negotiations, but Angela Merkel herself was heavily involved, as was also known from other negotiations, discussing with the staff and making concrete text proposals herself. The Russian negotiator was Vladislav Surkov, with whom Angela Merkel often clashed by remaining firm until Putin made concessions. Overall, the Russian delegation did not perceive their Ukrainian colleagues as equals. The Ukrainian Foreign Minister Klimkin, former ambassador to Germany, tried hard to represent Ukrainian interests together with President Poroshenko. French President Hollande tended to stay in the background. The Minsk package of message was adopted early in the morning. It had a serious birth defect. Russia's failure to respect the agreed ceasefire, the timing of which had previously been the subject of fierce dispute. The Russians wanted to postpone the ceasefire further in order to make additional territorial gains. At the time, they were primarily concerned with capturing the strategically important Debaltseve railroad junction. In the end, the Russians agreed to a shorter deadline. The ceasefire was to begin at midnight on February 15, 2015. Instead of ceasing hostilities as agreed, the Russians continued their operations for another 3 days because the capture of Debaltseve took longer than expected. In addition, the Russian separatists in Luhansk and Donetsk did not withdraw their heavy weapons and obstructed the OSCE observers. This meant that they could not testify to the flow of weapons and soldiers, which Russia officially denied. As a result of Russia's actions, it was subsequently difficult for the Ukrainian president to push through the legislative and constitutional amendments provided in the Minsk agreement in the Ukrainian parliament, which were necessary in order to implement the agreed amnesty, autonomy, and electoral regulations. Russia in turn seized on this and accused Ukraine of not wanting to implement the Minsk agreement. Subsequently, attempts were made to establish disengagement zones between the parties to the conflict by means of the OSCE observer mission in order to reduce the daily tensions on the long front line. There were repeated ceasefire violations during the implementation of the Minsk agreement. Russia repeatedly undermined the agreement, for example, when it distributed thousands of passports and unilaterally held elections without the OSCE being able to confirm them. It was clear to the German government representatives that Russia has no great interest in implementing the agreement correctly. On paper, at least, the Minsk agreement had opened up the prospect of a diplomatic solution to the conflict. As we all know, the Minsk agreement was not successful and did not lead to the end of hostilities between Russia and Ukraine. Nevertheless, the measures of the Minsk agreement that need to be regulated might still be relevant with regard to possible ceasefire negotiations in the future. Under new circumstances, however, it is questionable whether the political format, the so-called Normandy format of the Minsk agreements, France, Germany, Ukraine, and Russia, is still a realistic option. I think it is worth considering whether a possible ceasefire in the Ukraine war could be declared by the Secretary General of the United Nations. If the political will be there, in my view, an unarmed observer force will no longer be sufficient to monitor the disengagement of troops and the cessation of the hostilities. A UN peacekeeping force under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter would be more appropriate. Anyway, a negotiated solution to the Ukraine war would have to include points which were also discussed in Minsk. For instance, a troop disengagement regime, fixed upper troop limits, sacrifice of the use of violence and force, a regulation of the minority issues, or the acceptance of a peacekeeping or at least an observer force. We will see in the future which of these considerations will be realized in order to find a diplomatic solution of the Ukraine war. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vad. So now, question and answer time. While you are collecting your thoughts, and I'm sure there will be loads of questions, I'll ask the first one, or it will have two parts. So the first question is specifically perhaps for Professor Sakwa. How would you respond to the argument which says something like the Minsk agreements was essentially return to the most brutal power politics of the 19th century or before, Because if you look at Minsk agreements, I mean, it has clauses about what Ukraine's constitution should and shouldn't be, which essentially Russians inserted there, and they demanded essentially peace of Ukraine. And the West was sort of happy to oblige. And my question for everyone is, let's assume that the Minsk agreements could have helped to avoid the current war. So let's assume that from 2014 and 15 onwards, Ukraine had implemented Minsk agreements. They gave autonomy to Donetsk and Lugansk oblasts. The Russians got an opportunity, obviously, to meddle in Ukrainian politics, both its internal and external politics, which they actually did long before that. So wouldn't you say that that was sort of would have been a good idea to go with that deal? In other words, was not a bad peace better than a good war? Thank you.
Thanks so much. No, I don't think Minsk means a return to 19th century politics, perhaps the opposite. It actually was a framework, as we heard, for negotiation. And more than that, it was negotiation with whom? And so the Russian position does sort of make sense, because if we think of the people of the Donbass with a certain agency, and this comes up with other issues, of course, Russo-Georgian War was all about the people, the agency of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. It wasn't there, these are not just simply stooges of Moscow's. In fact, Moscow did not recognize, or annex it, by the way, somebody said this morning, it was recognized the independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia on the 26th of August, 2008. But, as a result of a long, long process, which I won't go into, about the Georgia and the feeling that when Saakashvili came to power in Georgia, there was a negotiation, there was a deal which Putin and Russia felt that Saakashvili reneged on. They gave, if you remember, Adjaria was also one of those issues, and Russia delivered. And then what happened? Nothing. And then, of course, they started putting pressure on Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Similarly, in Ukraine. So, as I say, on both sides, there is this lack of sense of negotiation and diplomacy as precisely a hugely tough negotiations between positions that are deeply entrenched and opposed visions. So, and part of this, it's not an imagination, that there exists to this day a constituency which wanted a different model of Ukrainian state development. This came out in another excellent book on the development of the Donbass, which has come out, Dominic Arel and Jesse Driscoll. The book is called Russia's Unnamed War, and it's quite a clever title because it doesn't call it a civil war and doesn't call it a Russian invasion. It evades it by calling it an unnamed war. But the evidence of that book, and this Dominic Arel and Jesse Driscoll are major experts in the field, chapter and verse of how things developed after the Maidan revolution, after the false flag, Ivan Kachinovsky, I think convincingly shows that the shooting on the 20th of February was from Maidan-controlled Ukraine embassy, the conservatoire and elsewhere. So there was a whole dynamic at work, which was an escalatory dynamic, which of course escalated finally to the invasion of 2022. But one has to say that I think that all sides have repudiated and reneged on those charter principles. It's a catastrophe. I think that the whole expansion of the political West after 1991, I won't go into all what was promised in 1990 about NATO enlargement, but nevertheless, just one point. Zbigniew Brzezinski, a passionate advocate of NATO enlargement, in his famous book, The Grand Chessboard of 1997, said, but of course, NATO enlargement, it's important for all sorts of reasons, but we have to do it within the framework of a larger security order with Moscow. That's Zbigniew Brzezinski saying this in 1997, quite apart from all those in the United States, Kennan, and all those who warned about the consequences of the enlargement of the political West without some sort of negotiated mediation from Moscow, which had been complaining. It isn't even Putin, and he was rather moderate at the begining. Remember, he asked to join NATO in 2001. And then, of course, so it was Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and Putin have this issue. And again, so as I said, we have the terrible conflicts of a number of conflicts, the intra-Ukrainian one, the failure to solve the pan-European issue of some whatever framework for pan-European level of the Brzezinski sort, and William Burns made the same point. And of course, the larger global issue, which is Washington's clear sense after the end of the Cold War that it has to maintain its dominance, preeminence, primacy, call it what you will. Thank you.
Any other takers? Yeah, Jakob.
Yeah, just in response to your second question, what if the Minsk agreements had been implemented? I mean, they were very vague in many respects. Let's assume they had been implemented in a way that had made Russia happy. So autonomy to an extent, essentially the self-declared Donetsk and Luhansk separatist republics had some sort of veto over Kiev's foreign policy orientation, European integration. Let's just imagine that, like, this was not some, essentially, who wasn't, essentially remains in power in Donetsk and Luhansk was not some sort of local separatist group, but a group of, well, essentially criminals, thugs, that received direct orders from Moscow. So, and I guess you could make an argument that Russia would have been happy with the state where these people were still taking orders from Moscow and had significant influence in Kiev. But under this kind of regime, it's very difficult to imagine Ukrainian politics and society evolving more towards progressive, liberal, democratic state. And a lot of the, we heard in one of the previous panels about the successes of the reform process in many areas. And I think this would have been very difficult to achieve under this kind of Minsk regime as envisioned by Russia. And I think it is questionable if Russia would have been content even with that kind of setup. There's also the issue of Viktor Medvedchuk, for example, who very close ally of Putin, who essentially kept trying, I'm sure with Moscow's blessing, to undermine Ukrainian politics with his own agenda. And I think probably the fact that Zelensky started to crack down on Medvedchuk and his movement more seriously was probably one of the things that actually contributed to Russia going for the full-scale invasion, because it became more and more apparent that this whole idea, this whole plan of undermining Ukraine without raising the stakes as much as it did with the full-scale invasion wasn't successful in the end. So, I mean, long story short, now in hindsight, would this kind of bad peace, as you say, been better than the war we have now? I have my doubts. At the end of the day, that's for the Ukrainian people to think about and decide. But at the end of the day, it's not the question. It's a hypothetical question right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? No?
Maybe 3 short points. With regard to the Minsk agreement, Angela Merkel and all the others who are dealing with this issue inside the Normandy format tried to solve an armed conflict. And for me, this was a very serious try, and they wanted to come out of this conflict situation, and they wanted to develop a political concept for that, which we don't have at the moment with regard to the Ukrainian war. And Richard, you mentioned this advice of Brzezinski, which was very wise. I remember that that we have to find ways for European peace order, including Russia. And in the beginning of the NATO expansion, we followed the advice of Brzezinski because we gave the Russians certain advantages to accept the NATO expansion. We founded this NATO Founding Act in the 90s, and we established the NATO-Russia Council in Brussels, and we gave Russia the opportunity to gain the World Health Organization and the G8 organization and other things, but we left this way later on, and I think this was a mistake. If I see that back we should learn from that, and in the end we will never find a peaceful solution in Europe without Russia as a player in that game, and we can forget that. And if we now have the opinion we must beaten the Russians militarily on the ground of the Ukraine, apart from the fact that it's far away from a realistic approach, we must accept this, and this Henry Kissinger told us in Davos before he died. He said we should never accept a strategic vacuum in East Eurasia, which would happen if the federal, if Russia, as the federal organization of those countries, lose. I mean, we have more than 120 different ethnical and political sovereign states within the Russian Federation. And if Russia loses as a power in this region, we have a strategic vacuum which we have to organize. And Henry Kissinger also wants before to push the Russians in the arms of the Chinese. This we have also to see the effects of our politics towards the Ukraine war. Yeah.
Maybe. Thank you. I forgot to mention during my speech, so probably will use this notes now. When preparing for this meeting, I found the notes that I wrote after the negotiations in Minsk, and they were about the leaders. And I wrote that Putin was arrogantly late and proud of himself. Poroshenko was extremely exhausted. François Hollande was desperately unconscious, and Merkel was just being Merkel. Why I'm saying this? Because when talking about alternative history, that's important as an analyst. I usually analyze track record. And Putin's track record is that he promised to build liberal democracy in Russia, and he didn't. He promised to never censor media, and he does it. He promised never to do anything to his opponents, and he's killing his opponents. He promised many times in the interviews that Crimea is not an issue for Russia, and that they recognize the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and they even signed a treaty, a friendship treaty with Ukraine, and then they just broke it. Then he said that even already after invasion, he said that no, LNR, DNR, they still can be Ukrainian. Ukraine just need to fulfill the agreements, and then he recognizes their independence. So I don't think that trusting Putin is a good idea. I mean, he has a very bad credit history. And I also don't think that monster, sorry for using this word, but I can use another one. When I read what Medvedev is saying, and Medvedev is not just a crazy guy in the internet, he works for the Security Council of Russia, and he threatens the world with nuclear destruction. He threatens to bomb London. He threatens to kill everyone who stands against their regime. I don't think that this monster was born yesterday, or that this monster was born as a result that Kyiv just didn't agree to grant autonomy to its eastern regions. No, this monster was born much earlier. We just didn't want to see it coming. So I don't think that any Minsk agreements would stop him, but we still can stop him now.
Thank you very much. I guess we can get a round of very short and sharp questions, a few in a row. So who would like to? Yes, the lady at the back, Una.
Thank you very much. I have a question to Jakob Hauter. Thank you very much for your presentation. I think it was very good, and I really share your perspective, and I'm really looking forward to reading your book. I think that this, what you said about the elephant in the room, which nobody wanted to see or pretended not to see, is very telling. And my question would be, how do you explain that the Western powers obviously pretended not to see that Russia is attacking Ukraine and that Ukrainian sovereignty has been violated? I have my own thoughts about it, but I will keep them to myself, but I would really be interested in your explanation. How come that people decided not to see the elephant, not that they didn't see it?
Okay, thank you very much. More questions, but shorter than that. Who'd like to? Yes, gentleman here. Yes, gentleman at the front. Yeah.
Thank you. Perhaps a little shift of focus will help here. There are certain regimes which are only sustainable if they wage war. And that is certainly the case with Putin's democratic regime. If it were not Ukraine, it would be Estonia or something else. Would you agree with that?
Thank you. And one last question. Okay, so Mr. Lithuanian.
Oh, thank you. Vytautas Bruveris, musician Celta from Lithuania. Questions to both Mr. Sakwa and Mr. Vad. So please sum it up in like main essential 2 or 3 bullet points. What makes you believe that some sort of deal, setting the deal with Russia is still possible? Kind of real deal, sustainable deal, which stops Russian regime from further escalation.
Thank you very much. So quick questions, quick answers. Who'd like to start? Yes, let's start from the left.
Yeah, why didn't they see the elephant in the room? I would say there are probably 2 factors. Actually, Pavel mentioned one of them. Just it would have pushed the West too much out of its comfort zone. In a way, the Minsk process still allowed to more or less continue business as usual with Russia, and somehow allowed the West to not talk about additional military means, deterrence, the possibility of a major war in Europe, which was the more comfortable path to go down, but also then in the end contributed to the invasion of 2022. And the second point, I think, is probably an information warfare, disinformation aspect to it, that still to a large extent too many political actors in the West bought into this idea of that the core issue at stake was internal. There was some sort of oppression of Russian speakers, that this was really somehow about Donbas autonomy and so on. And unfortunately, even today in this room, we heard some of this again, but it has a lot of traction to this day, apparently.
Maybe I will answer the question about Estonian future plans of Putin. I think that the answer was already given by Putin many times. I mentioned the track record, but also at one of his meetings with children, I think, a young school child asked him, Putin asked him where Russia ends. And then Putin answered himself, Russia ends nowhere. And this was before the invasion. So I think this is the answer. I think that when we draw the red lines for Russia, for the imperialistic Russia, aggressive Russia, we should have strength to keep them, not withdraw every time when Russia attacks, because it just creates wrong incentives for Russia to attack again and again. And I do agree that Russia will never end anywhere if we won't stop it. So we are, I agree now that it was said already that we are probably in one of the most dangerous points of the modern history of the humankind, and it is being decided now in the Ukrainian front.
I think with regard to the so-called big deal with Russia, I think we Europeans are not in a position to make such a deal. And I wished this were not the case, but at the moment China is trying to find a solution. They have a special mission ongoing in all these countries around Ukraine. And apart from that, I would say I also look forward the maybe re-election of Donald Trump. I mean, I don't love him, but I mean, he's maybe the only guy who is able to make such a deal. Because then behind this deal stands a superpower, the Western superpower, the United States of America. And this makes a further deal confident, maybe. But I cannot watch in the future. But Trump said that several times during the election campaign that he will talk to his old friend Vladimir, and then they found a solution. And during his first session, he also tried to find a solution with North Korea. Remember that. He wanted always to speak with this so-called rocket man. And maybe both guys find a solution. I have no other idea how, from a practical point of view, who is able to do it.
On the first point about certain states which can only exist through expansion, aggression, etc., I think quite the opposite in this particular case. We know that before this war, before the 24th of February 2022, there was huge, this wasn't a war which was a popular cause. In fact, the population wasn't prepared for it. We know that there was a big meeting with the head of the central bank, Nabulina, and a whole stack of other, Kudrin and others in a dacha, in a pensionnat not far from Moscow, in which they absolutely told Putin a whole stack of things, that this will affect the economy, that we'll get awful sanctions and so on, and warned against it, and a whole slew of other people as well. But, of course, how then we need to study it, and I'm doing that, how we got to the decision-making on to go, which was ultimately Putin's personal decision, and the sense that ultimately Russia's back was to the wall, back to the wall. We had endless early, then we could look at how Putin's thinking evolved. We know that when he first came to power, he wanted to regularize all the borders with Estonia and Latvia. He said no, zero option, accept the existing borders, no addendums, no additions, but as we know, both Estonia and Latvia then added, say, Treaty of Tartu and the other one. Riga after the end of the First World War. And so time after time, this was an attempt to re-establish in North Eurasia. I agree, post-Soviet space is not a good term. North Eurasia, I think, is the term I would nowadays use, that we have a strategic vacuum, we did not have an adequate peace order, and this is why Putin of today was created through this failure over the last 20, 30 years. So quite the opposite. The consensus within Russia to this day is that they wanted to focus on internal development, peaceful external environment, but unfortunately the Ukrainian knot got worse and worse after what they perceive to have been an ultra-nationalist coup of February 2014, and then this acceleration and intensification. I'm not buying into it, but that's the way they see it. And of course we do know about Maidan. I mentioned Kachinovsky, I mentioned Gordon Hahn, and the way that this Maidan itself was a hugely divisive change of power. And that's one thing, not to justify it, to explain the logic. And the logic does have a logic to it. You don't have to buy into it. Second point, the peace deal. We know that it was there. We had the Istanbul peace deal, which was, in the circumstances, not a good one, but it was a deal. And Putin went along with it, signed a signature, and we know that why it failed. I'm not sure whether Boris Johnson's visit on the 9th of April was decisive, but certainly we know that even the NATO meeting on the 24th of March refused that deal, what was coming along. They said, we're not open for negotiation, such like, and so Boris Johnson then finally capped that. There was also a peace movement at the end of 2022, after the advances on Kherson and Kharkov. and Mark Milley, the chief of the General Staff in the US, said, you know, this is the time to make some sort of deal. To fight. I mean, clearly, today, I actually agree with those who say there is no deal to be made. So what is the alternative? So if today, then, the fate of Europe, Ukraine, and the world will be decided on the field of battle, then, you know, we're talking about, Medvedev is crazy, he's gone completely nuts, but it's Karaganov, Trenin, we've heard about this morning. There's a consensus, and ultimately the feeling in Moscow, and again, to report something doesn't mean to endorse it, but, the feeling is, they're in for the long haul. They will not be defeated. The West is, yet again, not allowing us to develop in peace and security. That's the way they say it, whether you like it or not. And that we're in for the long haul. 80% support for Putin. Even the Levada poll shows support, but they do not show support for the war. I make that distinction. There's no popular support for the war within Russia, but a grim sense of determination that we will see this to the end. And what is the end? It is obviously next stage, battlefield nuclear weapons. And we are, in other words, it's no longer a Cold War, you could argue. Emmanuel Todd argues this is already, we're in the foothills of World War III, where basically we're 1912, the Moroccan crisis, I don't know what analogy you wish to do. This isn't the 1930s. It's pre-First World War, sleepwalking into a conflict. This is just the beginning, unless we put an end to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Great panel, I think you would agree. Passionate, contentious, lively, and interesting. Let's assemble in about 5 minutes from now, and a big round of applause for our panel.